The Biden administration has been nominating some real kooks, some real radicals, some real extremists to important positions in the government. Now, happily, one of them, Neera Tanden, withdrew as Biden's nominee for the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. But there's a bunch of other kooks kind of all coming down the pike. There, of course, was Javier Becerra, Vanita Gupta. I want to focus now on a woman named Kristen Clarke, who is Biden's nominee to be the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Justice Department. Now, this is a very important position because it's the DOJ's division that deals with all these issues, from police brutality to hate crimes to human trafficking cases. Essentially, civil rights issues come under this purview. And this woman, Kristen Clarke, has a very interesting history, a history that actually goes all the way back to her days as head of the Black Students Association at Harvard. Now, it may seem odd a little bit to talk about somebody's kind of college days, but it's actually not, because very often when we think of radical ideas that we see in our culture, they were planted on the campus. Radical professors propagandize their students. The students begin to repeat all this sort of kookery. It's picked up by their fellow students. Pretty soon it becomes conventional wisdom. And then as these students graduate, they take these ideas with them. Now, sometimes when they get older, they recognize that it doesn't sound good to talk about things like black supremacy and melanin superiority. You believe those things, but you cover them up with a veneer of adult sophistication. So you begin to learn to use bureaucratic language. But in a sense, that is only on the surface. Underneath that, you still have, your heart is still beating with all these crackpot ideas. And we see this all around us in the culture. Now, recently, Kristen Clarke was criticized because she jumped, you may say, headfirst into the Jussie Smollett racial scam. She was completely on board with Smollett. She was criticizing the police for taking his cell phone. Here I have a tweet from her. She goes, Jussie Smollett subjected to a racist and homophobic attack. Prayers to Jussie Smollett for a speedy recovery from this hate crime. Now, of course, later it emerges that this was staged by Jussie himself. And of course, these bogus hate crimes have now become epidemic. They're staged, it seems, almost more often than you have real hate crimes, which shows you that, there's a market for these hate crimes because it propels unknown people. Not in Jussie's case, he was well known as an actor, but he was hoping to reach a kind of totemic status as the kind of ultimate victim. Meghan Markle was making a kind of similar play more recently. Now, Kristen Clarke has had a very interesting history. She was a professor at Howard University. She served in the Justice Department before. And when she was at Harvard, she was very active in fighting in favor of the Black cause. And she wrote an interesting letter to the Harvard Crimson, which I think is actually worth quoting because it shows you where she is sort of coming from, or what her formative ideas were. She goes, first of all, she quotes, Richard King, and she talks about the fact that the human brain contains large elements of melanin. Melanin is the coloring agent in the human body. And she goes on to argue that blacks have a lot of melanin, which makes them intellectually and morally and emotionally superior. And blacks and whites suffer from melanin defects that makes them such incorrigible, evil people. I'm going to give you some more quotes here. This is directly from Kristen Clarke. Some scientists have revealed that most whites are unable to produce melanin because their pineal glands are often calcified or non-functioning. And then, this is the key line, melanin endows blacks with greater mental, physical, and spiritual abilities, something which cannot be measured based on Eurocentric standards. Now, this is a key thing because what she's basically saying is that when you use these Eurocentric standards, like math tests and so on, blacks and other minorities may not score that well. But that's because these are Eurocentric standards. We don't need to be using them. What we should be looking at is at melanin levels. And blacks obviously excel. They've got the most melanin, even more than brown people who have melanin, but not as much. And it goes on in this vein. Now, this is straight out crack pottery. Of course, the human body does have melanin, but there's no research in the world that shows that melanin does any of these things, endows you with superior mental or emotional capacities. Not at all. Yet there's a whole literature out there. In fact, I stumbled on it when I was doing my book, The End of Racism. I have several pages on this. In fact, my section is called All About Melanin. And this goes back to the 1990s. In fact, I met a professor, Molefi Keti Asante, who was one of the expounders of this theory. In fact, he talked about the fact that Africans, he said, are mentally superior because they have, and emotionally superior, because they have what he called the palm tree mentality, because they've been raised in sort of tropical climates, whereas white men, he said, whites suffer from what he calls the caveman mentality. And it's all in the genes. That's the key point. The funny thing about this guy, Molefi Asante, is that he would wear massive African outfits, dashikis and so on. He spoke with an African accent. Finally, I asked him, I said, are you from Nigeria? He goes, no, Dinesh, I'm from Savannah, Georgia. Turns out the guy's real name is Arthur Lee Smith. He's not African at all. The whole thing was a staged act. So the point I'm trying to get at is that these melanin people are kooks. But what they do is they've mastered this kind of language as a pseudo-scientific language. They'll talk about, phonons and electromagnetic radiation, melanocytes, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus. This is a kind of bogus scientific or pseudo-scientific vocabulary that is used to justify what can only be called black supremacy. Now, the sad thing, and Kristen Clarke is sadly part of all this, is that we've had white supremacy. White supremacy was actually the political weapon of the Democratic Party. And in supposedly an effort to fight white supremacy, you think the way to fight supremacy is to fight supremacy. Fight this idea that there is some supremacy conferred by whiteness. That's nonsense. But instead of going there, what these activists like Kristen Clarke do is they try to fight white supremacy with black supremacy. So suddenly, whites are deprived of all these positive qualities, but they're now conferred, they're transferred to blacks. So now suddenly your blackness makes you smart. Your blackness makes you fast. Your blackness makes you sophisticated. Your blackness makes you more perceptive. And if it's not measured by any standards that we can objectively verify, well, then those standards are Eurocentric. How we got to a stage in this country where this kind of racial kookery, this racial nutso claims have become mainstream is a whole other question. But the sad news is we find it not just in academia, not just in culture, but now penetrating the organs of government as well.